This is the story of Morgan Freeman's most unexpected night that changed not just his life, but the lives of hundreds of forgotten American heroes. December 15, 2010, started as another quiet evening at Freeman's 124-acre ranch in Charleston, Mississippi. At 73 years old, Freeman had retreated to his beloved countryside after the devastating car accident 2 years earlier that had left him with chronic pain and limited mobility in his left hand. The sprawling property, with its rolling hills covered in native Mississippi oak trees and meandering streams that fed into the nearby Tallahatchie River, had become his sanctuary from the demands of Hollywood and the constant reminders of his physical limitations that now defined his daily existence in ways he was still learning to accept. Freeman was alone that night, as he was most nights since the accident had fundamentally altered not just his physical capabilities, but his entire approach to social interaction and public engagement. His household staff had gone home hours earlier, leaving him in the profound peace and silence of his farmhouse that overlooked the river valley where his ancestors had once lived and worked under very different circumstances. The house itself was a testament to understated elegance and personal history, not the flashy mansion one might expect from a Hollywood legend, but a comfortable, lived-in home filled with carefully chosen books, meaningful artwork, and tangible memories of a long career that had taken him from the stages of San Francisco to the sound stages of Los Angeles, and finally to this quiet corner of the American South where his family roots ran deep. He was sitting in his favorite worn leather armchair by the massive stone fireplace, a piece of furniture that had molded itself to his body over years of evening reading sessions, currently absorbed in a biography of Frederick Douglass that had been sitting on his reading table for weeks. The irony of reading about another man, who had overcome seemingly impossible circumstances while dealing with his own challenges of aging and physical limitation, was not lost on him. Occasionally, he would glance up from the pages to look out the large picture windows that offered panoramic views of his property, watching the last light of December afternoon fade into the particular darkness that comes to rural Mississippi in winter, complete, enveloping, broken only by the distant lights of neighboring farms scattered across the landscape like fallen stars. The weather had been behaving strangely all day, creating an atmosphere of expectation and unease that Freeman couldn't quite shake. December in Mississippi was usually mild and manageable, characterized by temperatures that might require a light jacket but rarely anything more substantial. But today the temperature had dropped dramatically as evening approached, creating the kind of sharp, biting cold that reminded longtime residents that they were still technically in the American South, where weather could change rapidly and catch everyone unprepared. The local weather reports had been increasingly urgent throughout the day, predicting something unusual and potentially dangerous, a rare winter storm system moving down from the northern plains that could bring significant snowfall to a region that rarely saw more than a light dusting and was consequently unprepared for serious winter weather in terms of both infrastructure and individual preparedness. Freeman had lived in Mississippi long enough, both as a child and now as a returning adult, to know that when winter weather hit the South, it hit hard and fast and with devastating effect, catching government agencies, utility companies, and individual residents completely unprepared for conditions that northern states managed routinely, but which could paralyze entire southern communities for days or even weeks. The wind had been picking up steadily since late afternoon, creating an eerie, whistling sound as it moved through the bare branches of the ancient oaks that surrounded his property, trees that had witnessed generations of Mississippi history, and now stood sentinel over his evening solitude. The house creaked and settled around him with the familiar sounds of old wood responding to temperature changes, a symphony of subtle noises that had become as comforting as a lullaby during his years of residence here. His walking cane rested against the arm of his chair, a constant reminder of the physical limitations that had reshaped his daily routine and forced him to approach even simple tasks with careful planning and deliberate movement. Around 9 p.m., he heard the first distant rumble of motorcycle engines, a sound that seemed to emerge from the approaching storm itself, like mechanical thunder rolling across the rural landscape, growing steadily louder and more distinct as it approached his isolated property. Freeman moved toward his front door, his progress slower than he would have liked due to his physical limitations, but his resolve firm and unwavering despite the uncertainty of the situation unfolding outside his home. The Hollywood legend, who had portrayed wise mentors and moral authorities on screen, was about to face a real-life situation that would test those same qualities without the safety of scripted dialogue, predetermined outcomes, or the ability to call cut if things went wrong. As he reached for the brass door handle, polished smooth by decades of use, there was a firm but respectful knock, not the aggressive pounding of desperate men or the frantic hammering of people in panic, but the measured, disciplined approach of individuals who understood protocol and respect, even in crisis situations that might excuse less courteous behavior. Freeman opened the heavy wooden door to find a tall, weathered man in his 60s standing on his covered porch, snow accumulating, steadily on his broad shoulders and graying beard, his posture erect despite the harsh conditions and his age. Behind him, Freeman could see dozens of other figures moving through the swirling storm, their faces largely obscured by winter gear, scarves, and protective equipment, but their body language unmistakably speaking of military discipline, mutual concern, and the kind of organized response to adversity that comes from shared training and experience in difficult circumstances. The man at his door had intelligent, piercing eyes that conveyed both natural authority and hard-earned humility. And when he spoke, his voice carried the distinctive cadence and measured tone of someone long accustomed to command responsibility, but wise enough through experience to ask rather than demand, to request rather than order. "Sir, I'm deeply sorry to disturb you at this late hour," the man began, his words accompanied by visible breath in the frigid air that spoke to how quickly the temperature had dropped. "I'm Colonel James Mitchell, retired United States Army. These men with me are all veterans, mostly Vietnam era, and were caught in weather conditions that are turning genuinely dangerous for men our age." Freeman listened intently as Colonel Mitchell explained their increasingly dire situation with the calm, factual delivery of a military briefer, accustomed to conveying critical information clearly and efficiently. They were members of a veteran motorcycle club called the Rolling Thunder, an organization dedicated to supporting fellow veterans and keeping alive the memory of those brave men who hadn't made it home from the jungles and rice paddies of Southeast Asia. They rode together, not just for fellowship and camaraderie, but as a form of group therapy and mutual support, finding in their shared journeys across American highways the brotherhood, purpose, and sense of mission that civilian life too often failed to provide for men who had served their country in a uniform. "We've got men out here in their 70s, some with serious health issues and medical conditions that make this kind of cold genuinely dangerous to their well-being and possibly their lives," Mitchell continued with growing urgency. "The nearest motel is 30 miles away through increasingly treacherous road conditions, and according to radio reports, the highways are already becoming impassable for vehicles, let alone motorcycles carrying elderly passengers." His voice carried the weight of command responsibility for the welfare of his men. "I know this is a significant imposition on your privacy and hospitality, sir, but we're hoping you might have some shelter where we could wait out the worst of this storm safely." Freeman looked past Mitchell's imposing figure at the assembled riders, seeing in their faces and military bearing the unmistakable signs of men who had served their country with honor and were now facing another type of battle, the fight to stay warm, safe, and alive in conditions that could quickly become life-threatening for individuals their age. Many of them appeared to be his age or older, men who had already given the best years of their lives to military service in distant hostile lands and who now deserved far better than to freeze on a back road in rural Mississippi because of an unexpected weather emergency that had caught them far from adequate shelter. Freeman felt something stir within him that he hadn't experienced in months, a sense of purpose and the opportunity to help others in genuine need, rather than simply existing in comfortable isolation. The warm light from his fireplace cast long shadows across the porch, illuminating faces etched with experience, hardship, and quiet dignity that spoke of lives lived in service to others and causes greater than personal comfort. Freeman's spacious living room and adjacent dining area quickly filled with voices as the veterans settled in, their conversations revealing fragments of shared histories and mutual concern for each other's well-being that spoke to bonds forged under the most difficult circumstances imaginable. Freeman moved among them with careful deliberation, his walking cane providing necessary support as he offered coffee from his kitchen, warm blankets from upstairs closets, and the genuine hospitality that his Mississippi upbringing had taught him was the proper and moral response to travelers in need, regardless of their appearance or circumstances. As he listened to their conversations, he began to understand that this was far more than just a reunion ride or casual social gathering. It was a carefully maintained lifeline for men who had struggled for decades to find their rightful place in a society that had not always welcomed them home with the gratitude and support their service deserved. Many of these veterans had returned from Southeast Asia to face not ticker-tape parades and heroes' welcomes, but protests, indifference, and sometimes outright hostility from a civilian population that had grown weary of an unpopular war, and unfortunately transferred that weariness to the young men who had answered their country's call to serve. "Mr. Freeman," said a soft-spoken man named Robert Washington, a black veteran approximately Freeman's age, whose eyes held the particular weariness and hard-won wisdom of someone who had fought two distinct but related battles, one for his country in the jungles of Vietnam and another for recognition, respect, and equal treatment at home in an America still struggling with its own racial divisions. "I want you to know how much this simple act of hospitality means to all of us gathered here tonight. Most people see our motorcycles and our patches and leather jackets and immediately make assumptions about who we are and what we represent. They don't see the military service, the personal sacrifices we made, or the fact that we're just trying to take care of each other the way we learned to do in the military when survival depended on mutual support and brotherhood." Freeman nodded with understanding that went far beyond polite acknowledgement or celebrity graciousness, recognizing in Washington's words a familiar struggle that resonated deeply with his own experiences. He had spent decades navigating assumptions about who he was based on his appearance, his background, and his profession, fighting for roles that went beyond racial stereotypes and for recognition as a serious artist rather than just another black entertainer filling a predetermined slot in Hollywood's limited imagination. The parallels between his experience as a black actor fighting for meaningful, complex roles and these veterans' ongoing struggle for recognition, respect, and adequate support were not lost on him, creating an immediate bond of understanding that transcended differences in profession or life experience. As the evening progressed and the storm continued to rage outside with increasing intensity, the conversation naturally evolved from immediate concerns about weather and shelter to deeper, more personal stories, not the heroic tales of combat that civilian audiences often expected to hear, but quieter, more intimate stories that revealed the true character of military service. These men shared moments of profound fear and uncertainty, acts of unexpected kindness between soldiers who had nothing except each other, the challenge of maintaining humanity and moral clarity in situations where survival often required difficult choices, and perhaps most importantly, the ongoing struggle to adjust to civilian life after experiencing the unique intensity and unbreakable brotherhood that military service created among men who had faced life and death together. Freeman found himself drawn deeply into these conversations, sharing his own stories of struggle and perseverance in the entertainment industry, creating authentic connections that went far beyond the typical celebrity-fan relationship he usually had to navigate carefully in public settings. These men weren't seeking autographs or selfies. They were engaging with him as a fellow human being who had faced his own challenges and emerged with dignity intact. The fireplace crackled warmly as stories continued to flow, each veteran sharing pieces of his journey from military service to civilian life, the challenges of finding employment that valued their skills, the struggle with physical and emotional wounds that didn't always show on the surface, and the profound importance of maintaining connections with others who understood their experiences without need for explanation or justification. Mr. Freeman, said a veteran named Michael Torres, who'd been relatively quiet for most of the evening, nursing a cup of coffee and listening to others share their stories. "Can I ask you something deeply personal that's been weighing on my mind?" Freeman was immediately struck by the vulnerability in the question and the genuine courage it took to ask such a thing in front of other men who might be struggling with similar concerns and fears. He thought about his own journey since the car accident, the frustration and periods of depression that had accompanied his physical limitations, enforced withdrawal from many activities that had previously defined his sense of self and purpose. "Michael," Freeman replied thoughtfully, settling into a nearby chair and giving the man his complete attention. "Ask me anything you want. After the hospitality you've all shown me tonight, honest conversation is the least I can offer in return. How do you deal with getting older, with your body not doing what it used to do, with feeling like maybe your best days are behind you and everything meaningful you're going to accomplish has already happened?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, creating a moment of profound silence as other conversations gradually stopped and men turned their attention to Freeman's response. Freeman realized that his answer would matter deeply to every person in the room, all of whom were grappling with similar questions about aging, relevance, physical decline, and the search for continued meaning and purpose in lives that had been fundamentally shaped by military service that was now decades in the past. "Michael," Freeman began carefully, "I think the key is understanding that our value as human beings isn't measured just by what we can do physically or professionally, or even by what we accomplished when we were younger and stronger. Our worth is measured by how we treat each other, how we use our accumulated experience and hard-earned wisdom to help others navigate their own challenges, and how we continue to contribute to something larger and more important than our individual concerns and limitations." The conversation that followed was unlike anything Freeman had experienced in years, creating connections and insights that would influence his thinking long after this extraordinary night ended. These men, who had served their country with distinction and then struggled to find their rightful place in civilian life, shared their deepest fears about aging, personal irrelevance, and the persistent feeling that their sacrifices and service were being forgotten or minimized by a society that seemed increasingly disconnected from the values they had fought to defend. Freeman realized that his own struggle with post-accident limitations and his gradual withdrawal from public life had created a form of isolation and self-doubt that was remarkably similar to what many of these veterans experienced on a daily basis. Around midnight, as the storm reached its peak intensity outside and the wind howled through the bare trees surrounding his property, Freeman made a decision that surprised even him with its spontaneity and emotional honesty. "Gentlemen," he announced to the room, his voice carrying the authority that had made him one of Hollywood's most respected actors, "I want to share something with you that I haven't discussed publicly and have barely acknowledged to myself." The room fell completely quiet as Freeman spoke openly about his car accident, the chronic pain and physical limitations that had followed, and most importantly, the depression and sense of diminished purpose that had driven him to retreat from much of the social interaction and professional activity that had previously energized and motivated him. He talked about the loneliness of his Mississippi ranch, the growing sense that his most productive and meaningful years were behind him, and his ongoing search for new sources of meaning and purpose in a life that had been fundamentally altered by circumstances completely beyond his control. The vulnerability and honesty of Freeman's admission seemed to unlock something profound in the room, creating permission for other men to share their own struggles with similar openness and authenticity. Veterans began talking about battles with PTSD that had cost them marriages, relationships, and career opportunities, financial difficulties that threatened their basic security and independence, health problems that limited their mobility and autonomy, and the persistent, painful feeling that civilian society neither understood nor truly valued their military experience. What emerged from these deeply personal conversations was a recognition of shared challenges that crossed traditional boundaries of race, economic background, and personal history, creating bonds of understanding and mutual support that would extend far beyond this single night. Colonel Mitchell approached Freeman during a lull in the conversation, his expression serious but deeply grateful, carrying the weight of command responsibility that never fully leaves a military leader, even decades after retirement. "Sir, I need you to know something important about the men you're helping tonight," he began, his voice low and respectful, but carrying an urgency that demanded attention. Many of them are dealing with problems that go way beyond simply needing shelter from a winter storm. We've got veterans here who are struggling with post-traumatic stress disorder, severe financial difficulties, health issues directly related to their military service, and the kind of social isolation that can literally destroy a man if he doesn't have brothers willing to stand with him through the darkest times. Freeman listened intently as Mitchell explained the deeper, more complex purpose of Rolling Thunder and similar veteran organizations across the country. They provided not just fellowship and camaraderie, but practical life-saving support for men who had fallen through the cracks of an overburdened and underfunded VA system and a broader society that often honored their service in words and ceremonies while failing to provide adequate, sustained support in practice when veterans needed it most. These organizations had become informal safety nets, catching men who might otherwise disappear entirely from society's consciousness and concern. Some of these men, Mitchell continued with visible emotion, haven't had anyone show them genuine kindness or basic human respect in months or even years. What you're doing tonight, opening your home without hesitation, treating us like honored guests rather than charity cases or burdens to be managed, that means more than you might ever realize. As Freeman moved through his house during the long evening, checking on his unexpected guests and ensuring everyone was comfortable and warm, he began to see them not as a homogeneous group but as distinct individuals, each carrying his own unique story of service, sacrifice, personal loss, and ongoing survival. There was Tommy Rodriguez, a former Marine who had lost 3 fingers and part of his left hand to an improvised explosive device in the Mekong Delta, but had painstakingly learned to play guitar again using modified techniques and now used music therapy to help other veterans deal with trauma and find constructive outlets for emotions that had nowhere else to go. James "Doc" Patterson had served as a Navy medic during some of the war's most intense battles, and he continued to provide informal but skilled medical care to veterans who couldn't afford proper health care or navigate the bureaucratic maze of VA services effectively. William Chen, whose parents had immigrated from China with dreams of American opportunity, had served 2 tours as an Army interpreter and intelligence specialist, and now worked tirelessly with immigrant veteran communities who faced additional barriers to accessing services due to language difficulties and cultural misunderstandings. Each man Freeman met and spoke with carried within him a story of military service that had fundamentally shaped his understanding of duty, sacrifice, and brotherhood. And each also carried the ongoing daily challenge of translating military skills, values, and experiences into civilian success and personal satisfaction. Freeman began to understand with growing clarity that for many of these men, the motorcycle club wasn't just a social organization or hobby group. It was a critical survival mechanism, providing structure, purpose, clear hierarchy, and brotherhood that helped fill the enormous void left when military service ended and they returned to a civilian world that often seemed chaotic, selfish, and indifferent to the values they had learned to hold sacred. As the night wore on and the storm intensified outside, creating a cocoon of warmth and safety, inside Freeman's home, he found himself engaged in conversations that were more meaningful, substantial, and personally enriching than most of the interactions his celebrity status usually generated in public settings. These men weren't impressed by his fame or seeking favors, autographs, or opportunities for social media posts. They were simply grateful for his hospitality and genuinely interested in connecting with him as a fellow human being who had faced significant challenges and obstacles in his own life and emerged with wisdom, dignity, and compassion intact.